Clara Whitfield set down her bags at the edge of the mountain trail and did not cry. She had promised herself that. Not one more tear for a father who'd handed her off like a broken plow, something worn out. Something he no longer needed. Her hands shook. Her boots were split at the toe. And somewhere ahead, through 3 days of Colorado dust and summer heat, a stranger was waiting, a man nobody warned her about, and nobody thought to protect her from. She didn't know yet that he would be the first person in her life to see her clearly. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The morning Clara Whitfield left her father's house, he didn't walk her to the door. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold and his newspaper folded in half. And he didn't look up when she carried her 2 bags past him. He didn't look up when she paused at the threshold. He didn't look up when she said his name once quietly. The way a person says the name of something they've already lost. Goodbye, Papa. He turned a page. That was all. Clara walked out into the June heat and kept walking. She walked through the yard where she'd learned to shell peas as a girl. Past the fence post where she'd carved her initials at age 7. Certain that act would make her permanent somehow. Past the elm tree her mother had planted the year before she died. The one her father had threatened to cut down every summer since, because the roots were pushing up the fence line. She didn't look back, not because she wasn't hurting. Because she'd learned, a long time ago, that looking back only made it harder to keep moving forward. Her father, Earl Whitfield, was a practical man. That was how the town of Hatcher's Creek described him. Practical, steady, a man who ran his numbers carefully and made decisions without sentiment getting in the way. What that meant, in the plainest terms, was this: Earl Whitfield had 3 sons and 1 daughter. And the sons were useful, and the daughter was not. The sons could work land. They could negotiate at auction. They could sit at a table with other men and be taken seriously. They would marry women who brought connections or property, or at least the promise of more children to carry the family name forward. Clara could do none of those things, or rather Clara could do all of those things. She could outwork 2 of her brothers on a bad day. She could read a ledger faster than any man in the county and find the mistake before the accountant did. She could negotiate at the feed store and at the market, and once, when her father was too sick to leave his bed, she had handled the sale of 40 head of cattle on her own. Gotten a better price than he'd expected, and handed him the full sum without keeping a cent. He had taken the money without comment. That was the year she turned 24. By 27, after 3 years of being reminded in 100 small ways that she was a temporary inconvenience in her father's household, a mouth to feed, a room occupied, a future that someone else would have to solve, Clara had accepted the truth. She was not seen, not by her father, not by the men of Hatcher's Creek who looked through her at church, not by the women who spoke over her at social gatherings, discussing suitable matches as if she weren't sitting right there, with opinions of her own. She existed in that town the way a spare chair exists in a room. Present, unused, easy to move aside. And when the letter came from her father's old acquaintance, a man named Dawson, who ran a boarding arrangement up in the Colorado mountains, something between a ranch and a roadhouse, Earl Whitfield had seen an opportunity. He'd told Clara about it over supper one evening, in the tone he used when he'd already decided something and was merely informing her of the outcome. Dawson's looking for help. A woman who can cook, keep house, manage his books. You'll go up there and make yourself useful. He cut his meat without looking at her. Lord knows you haven't managed it here. And if I don't want to go? Clara asked. She knew the answer before she finished the question. Her father set down his knife. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man assessing something he'd held on to longer than he should have. Then you find somewhere else to be, he said, because come fall, I'm giving your room to your brother Thomas and his wife. They'll be needing the space. He picked his knife back up. 2 weeks, he said. I'd suggest you start packing. She packed in a single evening. Not because she owned much. She owned almost nothing that was truly hers, a few dresses. Her mother's Bible, a small tin box with some letters and her birth certificate, and $32 she'd saved over 3 years by setting aside pennies from the grocery money when she could. $32. That was the sum total of Clara Whitfield's independence. She held the tin box in her hands that night and thought about her mother, who had died when Clara was 12. Her mother had been a gentle woman who hummed while she worked and pressed wildflowers between the pages of books and told Clara, in the quiet moments before sleep, that a woman who knew her own heart could never truly be lost. Clara had held on to that, through every dismissal. Every dinner where her opinions went unheard. Every Sunday where she sat in the church pew and watched other women be chosen and wondered what invisible flaw she carried that made her so consistently overlooked. She'd held on to it, and now she was walking toward a mountain she'd never seen. To work for a man she'd never met, because her father had decided her time in his house had run out. But she was still holding on to it. The stagecoach took her as far as a town called Ridgeline, which was 3 days from Hatcher's Creek and 2 days from the mountain property her father had described in vague, dismissive terms. Remote. Decent enough. Dawson will sort out the rest in Ridgeline. She learned that Dawson had been dead for 6 weeks. A woman at the general store told her, tilting her head with the particular sympathy people reserve for strangers who have received bad news they haven't yet fully processed. Heart gave out, the woman said. Sudden like real shame. He was a decent fellow. Clara stood at the store counter with her 2 bags at her feet and processed this information very carefully. The property, she said. What happened to the property? Oh. It's still there. Somebody's been running it. A man named Carter. I think. Keeps to himself mostly. Folks in town don't know him real well. He comes in for supplies maybe once a month. Doesn't stay for conversation. The woman lowered her voice the way people do when they're about to say something they've decided is a compliment but isn't entirely sure. Cold sort of man, quiet. But he keeps the cattle healthy. I'll say that for him. Is there someone I could hire to take me up there? Clara asked. The woman looked at her bags, then at her boots, then at Clara's face with an expression that held. Very briefly, a flicker of something that looked almost like admiration. Old Pete Garrett takes the supply wagon up that direction, she said. He leaves tomorrow morning from behind the livery stable. If you're serious, he'd probably take you for $1. I'm serious, Clara said. Pete Garrett was 63 years old. Built like a man who had spent 40 of those years arguing with mules. And completely uninterested in conversation. He agreed to take her for 75 cents because, as he put it, she didn't look like she'd caused trouble, and the wagon was going that direction anyway. She sat beside him on the wagon bench for 6 hours without either of them saying more than a dozen words. And she found she didn't mind. The silence was the honest kind. The kind that didn't require her to perform pleasantness she didn't feel. She watched the land change as they climbed. The flat scrub of the lower foothills gave way to pine. The pine thickened and the air cooled slightly, even in the June heat. And the light through the trees turned a different color, something older and quieter than the light down below. She thought about what she was riding toward. A dead man's property. A stranger who kept to himself. A situation her father had arranged without asking whether she wanted it. For reasons that had nothing to do with her welfare and everything to do with his convenience. She thought, this is what being used looks like. And then she thought, all right, but I am still here, and I am still going. Pete Garrett stopped the wagon at the base of a trail that wound up through the trees and said, End of the line, miss. The cabin's about 1.5 miles up that path. Can't take the wagon any further. Clara looked at the path. Then at her 2 bags, then at the late afternoon sun. Thank you, she said. She climbed down, collected her bags, and started walking. 1.5 miles with 2 heavy bags in split-toe boots on a rocky mountain trail in June was the kind of thing that stripped a person down to what they were actually made of. There was no room for performance, no room for dignity in the careful, curated sense. There was only the weight in her hands and the path under her feet and the particular stubbornness that had gotten her this far. She stopped twice. Both times she set the bags down, breathed, looked at the trail ahead of her, and picked them back up. She did not sit down. She did not think about her father. She did not wonder whether she'd made a mistake, because the alternative had been to have nowhere to go at all. And having somewhere to go, even somewhere uncertain, even somewhere she shouldn't, was still better than the particular emptiness of being unwanted in a house where she'd once been a child. She smelled wood smoke first. Then she heard a horse. Then she came around a bend in the trail, and there was the cabin. It was not what she'd expected, though she'd been trying not to expect anything. It was solidly built, the logs tight and well fitted, with a porch that ran the length of the front and a stone chimney and a woodpile, stacked with the kind of orderly precision that suggested the person who'd built it thought about winter, even in the middle of summer. A man was standing at the far end of the porch. He was tall, not dramatically so, but in the way of a man whose height you notice, because everything else about him is equally understated. He wore a worn brown hat and a collarless work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been set in its current expression for some time. He was watching her come up the trail with an expression that gave away nothing at all. Clara walked to the foot of the porch steps and stopped. She set one bag down. She kept her chin level. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said. "I was sent here by Earl Whitfield of Hatcher's Creek. He made arrangements with a man named Dawson." She paused. "I've since been told that Dawson passed." The man said nothing. He just looked at her, not the way men usually looked at her assessing. Dismissive, already categorizing her into a box labeled not interesting or not useful or not worth the trouble. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's genuinely trying to understand. "I know I'm arriving without proper warning," she continued, keeping her voice level, "and I understand if the arrangement no longer applies. But I walked 1.5 miles up this trail carrying these bags. And before we discuss anything else, I'd appreciate knowing your name." A long pause. "Carter," the man said. "William Carter." "Mr. Carter," she met his eyes. "I'm asking for one night. Somewhere to sleep that isn't the trail. In the morning I'll sort out what comes next." Another pause. Longer. William Carter stepped off the porch and walked down the 3 steps to where she stood. He reached down and picked up both her bags, the heavy ones, the ones that had been pulling at her arms for 1.5 miles, and carried them back up the steps without a word. At the door he stopped. "You eaten?" he said. "Not since this morning." He opened the door. That was the whole of their first conversation. The inside of the cabin was spare and clean. A table with 2 chairs, a cook stove, a shelf with a handful of books and some tin cookware, a wood stove against the far wall, a narrow cot in the back corner, and through a doorway she could see from where she stood what appeared to be a second smaller room. William set her bags down near the door. He went to the cook stove and stirred something in a pot without looking at her. Clara stood in the middle of the room and took it in. "Whose room is through there?" she asked. "Storage mostly," he said. "Dawson used it when he came up. There's a cot. I can sleep there. Figured you would." She looked at the shelf of books. Farmer's Almanac, a Bible, a survey book, 2 others she couldn't read the spines of from where she stood. "Were you here when Dawson died?" she asked. A pause. The stirring slowed. "Were you with him?" "Yes." She let that settle. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's a hard thing." He didn't respond to that. He ladled something into a bowl and set it on the table and said, "Sit down." The stew was simple venison. She thought, with some dried beans and whatever he had on hand, but it was hot and it was real, and she ate every bit of it while William stood at the cook stove with his bowl and ate facing away from her, which she thought at first was rudeness and then decided was simply habit. A man who'd lived alone a long time got used to eating without an audience. When she was done, she set the spoon down carefully and said, "Thank you." He turned, he looked at the empty bowl. Something in his expression shifted slightly, just slightly. Like a key moving in a lock that had been stiff. "Get some sleep," he said. "Morning comes early up here." She lay on the cot in the storage room that night, listening to the mountain dark, which was a different kind of dark than she'd ever known. Deeper, more complete. The kind of dark that made you aware of all the sounds that lived under the daylight noise wind in the pines. Something moving out in the trees, the distant low of cattle that told her there was more to this property than a cabin and a woodpile. She thought about her father. She thought about Dawson, who she'd never met, who had apparently arranged for her to come here, without considering that he might die before she arrived. She thought about William Carter, who had said fewer than 20 words to her, and fed her, and given her a place to sleep. She thought about the look on his face when he'd seen her empty bowl. Not charity, that look. Something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. She fell asleep with her hand on her mother's Bible, and the wood smoke smell still in her clothes. And she did not dream about Hatcher's Creek at all. She woke before dawn. Not because someone woke her, the cabin was silent. She woke because she had spent enough nights in uncertain places to know that the best time to understand where you were was before anyone else was moving. She got up quietly and dressed and went to the doorway. The main room was empty. William's cot, she could see it now. Against the wall where she hadn't looked the night before was made up neat. He was already gone. She built up the cookstove fire from the coals, found coffee in a pot and made it. She found eggs in a covered crock near the door. Still cool. She found a pan. She was scrambling eggs when the cabin door opened and William Carter came in carrying a bucket of water in each hand. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. He looked at the coffee on the back burner. He looked at the pan. He set the buckets down. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She set the eggs in front of him and poured him a cup of coffee and sat across the table with her own. She watched him look at the plate for a moment before he picked up his fork, and she recognized that expression. She had worn it herself more than once, the expression of a person not quite sure what to do with an unexpected kindness. "You can cook," he said. "I can do a fair number of things," she said. "If that's what you're wondering." He looked up at her. Direct. Appraising in a way that wasn't offensive because there was nothing calculating in it. "I'm not looking for a housekeeper," he said. "Good," she said. "I'm not looking to be one. I'm looking for a fair situation. Work I can respect, pay I can live on, and treatment doesn't make me feel like furniture." She held his gaze. "Dawson offered me room, board, and a wage in exchange for managing the household accounts and helping with the books. I don't know if that's something you need, but I thought I'd lay out what was on the table before either of us decides anything." A long pause. William turned his coffee cup in his hands, around and around. Slow. "Dawson always complained his books were a mess," he said. "Most ranch books are," Clara said. "I can fix a mess." "Month's trial," William said. "You do the books. Help where there's help needed. I'll pay you the same Dawson offered if you're useful. Less if you're not." "What did Dawson offer?" he told her. It wasn't much, but it was more than $32. "All right," she said. "Month's trial." He picked up his fork. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the night before. Less like two strangers waiting to be done with each other, and more like two people who had made a cautious, conditional decision to share the same air for a while, and were seeing how it felt. The first week was a series of discoveries. Clara discovered that William Carter ran a significantly larger operation than the single cabin suggested. There were cattle, she could hear them, and on the second day, when she followed the trail behind the cabin to where it opened into a side meadow, she could see them, a good-sized herd, well kept, managed by 2 hired men who came up from the lower valley each morning and went back down at dusk. Their names were Different Pete from the wagon driver, and a young man of about 20 named Cody, who had a gap in his front teeth and said "ma'am" every time Clara appeared, which she found both endearing and slightly exhausting. She discovered that William's books were not a mess, they were non-existent. Dawson had apparently kept everything in his head, and what records existed were a handful of receipts stuffed into a tobacco tin and a sales ledger from 2 years prior that covered half a transaction and then stopped. "How do you know if you're making money?" she asked, when she'd spread the contents of the tobacco tin across the table on her third morning. William looked at the scattered papers without apparent concern. "More money in the tin each spring than the fall before," he said. "That is not a bookkeeping system," Clara said. "It's worked so far. It's worked because you haven't had to prove anything to anyone," she said. "The moment you need to sell land, or apply for a credit line, or demonstrate to the county assessor what this operation is worth, you'll need actual records." She looked up at him. "Let me build you a real ledger, month by month, going back as far as I can reconstruct." He studied her for a moment. "All right," he said. She spent 3 days at the table doing nothing else. She pulled every receipt. She cross-referenced what she could against the old ledger. She sent Cody down to the Valley store with a list of questions about past purchases, and he came back with answers and also a bag of sugar because he'd thought she might need it, which she did. At the end of the 3 days, she had a clear picture. The operation was more profitable than it looked, considerably more. She set the completed ledger in front of William at supper and watched him turn the pages. She watched his expression. "This is 3 years," he said. 2.5. "That's as far back as I could reconstruct with confidence." She pointed to a row of figures. "Your operating cost is lower than it should be for a herd this size, which tells me either you're cutting corners somewhere or you're more efficient than average. From what I've seen, it's the second." She tapped another line. "But you've been underselling at fall auction. The per-head price you've been accepting is below what comparable cattle were going for in the valley by about 12%. He looked at the number. "Dawson handled the auctions," he said quietly. "I know. I'm not criticizing Dawson." She paused. "I'm telling you where the money's been going that shouldn't have." William sat with that for a moment. He set the ledger down carefully. "What would you do differently?" he said. "Get your own buyer. Don't go through the auction at all. There are buyers out of Denver who'd come to you for a herd this size and a quality rating this good. And you'd cut out the middleman's percentage entirely." She folded her hands on the table. "I can write the letters if you tell me I'm authorized to." He looked at her for a long moment with that same expression she'd seen at the door, the one that was trying to understand something it hadn't expected. "Write the letters," he said. The second week brought different discoveries. She discovered that William woke every morning before first light and was already working by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She knew because she had started waking at the same time not to keep up with him, but because the quiet before dawn had become her favorite part of the day. The hour when the mountain felt like it belonged to her, in a way nothing else ever had. She discovered that he took his coffee black in his meals without complaint, and that he had exactly one comfortable habit, which was sitting on the porch in the last light of the evening with a book. She'd asked him what he was reading, and he'd turned the spine toward her without comment. A volume of English poetry battered down to almost nothing at the corners. She'd been surprised enough that she'd said so. "Why?" he'd asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I suppose I hadn't expected it." "What had you expected?" She considered that. "I'm not sure. Something more practical." He'd looked at her over the top of the book and said, "The practical things don't help much at night," and then he'd gone back to reading. She'd stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. And then she'd gone inside. She discovered that he had a temper not the explosive, unpredictable kind she had learned to be afraid of in Hatcher's Creek, but the slow, cold kind that showed up when someone was being dishonest or cruel. She saw it once in that second week, when a man from the lower valley came up the trail to argue about a fence line and talked over Clara twice when she tried to ask a clarifying question. And William had put down the rope he was coiling and said, "Very quietly, the lady asked you something," and the way he said it made the man answer immediately and leave soon after. He didn't comment on it afterward. He picked the rope back up and went on coiling it. But Clara had watched it happen and filed it away in the same place she'd filed the empty bowl and the coffee in the ledger. William Carter was not the man his silence suggested. On the morning of the 11th day, Cody came up from the valley pale under his tan and said that there was a rider on the lower road asking questions about the ranch. "What kind of questions?" William said. He'd gone still in the way he went still when something had his full attention. "About who owns it now," Cody said. "About whether there's a clear title. About how big the herd is and whether the water right papers are in order." He turned his hat in his hands. "I didn't tell him nothing, Mr. Carter. But he said he'd be coming up. Said he had business." William didn't look at Clara, but she saw his jaw tighten. "What's his name?" William asked. "Holloway," Cody said. "Richard Holloway." Something changed in William's face. Fast and then controlled. "All right," he said. "Go on and get back to the fence line. Don't talk to anybody else about this." Cody left. Clara waited until his footsteps were gone down the trail. "You know that name," she said. William was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Who is he?" He picked up his hat from the porch post and settled it on his head. "A man who believes that whatever he wants, he should have." He looked at her steadily. "He's been circling this property for 2 years. Dawson wouldn't sell." "Now Dawson's gone," Clara said. "You said clear title, is it?" William looked at her for a moment. The look was complicated in a way she didn't have all the language for yet. "It's mine," he said. "Everything on it. Can you prove that?" A pause. "I can," he said. "But it's going to require some paperwork I've been putting off." Clara folded her arms. "Then we'd better stop putting it off," she said. He looked at her. And for just a moment quick, before it closed back up, she saw something in his face that looked like relief. "I'll get the papers," he said. He went inside. Clara stayed on the porch and looked down the trail toward the lower valley, where a man named Richard Holloway was riding toward them with questions about ownership and Watts rights, and the particular appetite of a man who had always gotten what he wanted. She thought about the tobacco tin full of receipts, the missing ledger years, the title papers William hadn't gotten around to. She thought about her $32, about her mother's Bible, about 3 days walking toward a dead man's property with 2 heavy bags and split-toe boots. She thought, "I have been in this position before. Somewhere someone else decided my situation for me, and I had to make the best of what I found." And then she thought, "Not this time." She went inside. "Show me the papers," she said. "All of them. Every deed, every water right, every survey. Show me what you have and what you're missing." William looked at her from across the table. "You know land law," he said. "I know enough," she said. "And what I don't know I can learn before that man gets here." She met his eyes. "You said month's trial. That hasn't run out yet. Let me be useful." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he went to the shelf behind the stove, moved the almanac aside, and pulled out a rolled document tied with a leather cord. He set it on the table in front of her. Clara untied the cord and spread the paper flat with both hands. She read. Outside, the summer wind moved through the pines, and somewhere down the trail, Richard Holloway was getting closer. And inside the cabin, William Carter stood at Clara Whitfield's shoulder. watching her read the document that mapped out everything he'd built and everything he stood to lose, and something in the set of his face had shifted from the expression she'd first seen on the porch. He didn't look like a man waiting to be helped. He looked like a man who had just realized, for the first time, that he wasn't facing this alone. The deed was real. Clara could see that much inside the first 2 minutes of reading. The handwriting was steady, the county seal pressed firm into the paper. The legal description of the land boundaries, written in the careful, repetitive language that meant someone had paid a proper surveyor to walk every edge of the property and write down exactly what they found. William Carter owned this land, but there were problems. "This deed covers the cabin and the north pasture," Clara said, spreading the paper flat and tracing the boundary lines with her finger. "What about the south meadow? The one where the herd grazes in the afternoon?" William was standing at her shoulder. She could feel the stillness of him, the way he held himself when something required his full concentration. "That's covered under a grazing lease," he said. "Separate document. Where is it?" A pause. "Dawson had it," he said. Clara looked up at him. She repeated. "He handled the county filings. I handled the cattle." She set the deed down carefully and pressed both hands flat on the table. "William, if that grazing lease isn't filed with the county recorder's office, and Holloway gets here before we can prove it exists." "I know," he said quietly. He could contest the southern boundary. He could argue the grazing rights lapsed when Dawson died, especially if there's no document on file. She turned to face him directly. "How long has Dawson been gone?" "6 weeks. And you haven't ridden to the county seat. It wasn't a question." He knew it wasn't. "No," he said. Why he was quiet for a moment in the way she'd learned meant he was choosing his words with care, not avoiding the question, because after Dawson died, there were things that needed doing. The herd, the fences. Pete and Cody were good workers, but they needed direction. He paused. "And because I thought I had time, you didn't think Holloway would move this fast?" "No," he said. "I underestimated him." Clara picked up the deed again and rolled it back carefully. "How far is the county seat?" "Millerton, day's ride?" "Roughly. Day and a half if the mountain road is slow. Can you be there and back before Holloway arrives?" "Depends on when he arrives. Cody said he was on the lower road this morning." "That's what, 4 hours down?" "3 if he pushes." Clara did the math. It wasn't comfortable math. "Then you leave now," she said. "Today. Take a fast horse and go to Millerton and find every document with this property's name on it and bring back certified copies of all of them." She held out the deed. "Take this with you. The county recorder needs to see the original." William took the deed. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "That leaves you here alone," he said. "If Holloway comes before I'm back, then I'll talk to him," Clara said. "Clara, I handled my father's cattle sale alone," she said. "I can handle a conversation with a man who hasn't arrived yet." She met his gaze and held it. "I'll be polite. I'll be vague. I won't sign anything, agree to anything, or let him pass the porch. But someone needs to go to Millerton. And I can't ride that road as fast as you can." She paused. "Go." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he picked up his hat and walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. He didn't turn around. "There's a rifle above the door," he said. "You know how to use one?" "My father had 3 sons," Clara said. "He made sure I could shoot before I could vote, for all the good either did me." Something shifted in William's shoulders. Not quite a laugh, but close. "I'll be back by nightfall tomorrow," he said. And then he was gone. Holloway arrived at noon. Clara heard the horse first, and then she heard voices more than one, and she moved to the window and counted 3 riders coming up the trail. The man in the lead was broad-shouldered and well-dressed for mountain travel, which told her he was the kind of man who wanted to look powerful even when there was nobody important watching. He had silver hair at his temples and the confident, unhurried pace of someone who had never arrived anywhere and found the answer to be no. She went to the porch. She folded her hands in front of her and waited. Holloway pulled up his horse and looked at her, the way men like him looked at women they hadn't expected to find not quite dismissive, not quite respectful, but with the particular calculation of someone rearranging a plan on the fly. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for the man who runs this property." "William Carter." "Mr. Carter is away on business," Clara said pleasantly. "I'm managing the household in his absence. May I help you?" Holloway smiled. It was the smile of a man who had learned long ago that smiling first was a negotiating tool. "And you are?" "Clara Whitfield," she said. "And you, I believe, are Mr. Richard Holloway." A beat of surprise crossed his face. "Just a beat. Word travels," he said. "In the mountains." "Most things do. What can I do for you, Mr. Holloway?" He dismounted. His two men stayed in their saddles. He walked toward the porch steps with the easy confidence of a man who expected to be invited in. And Clara stayed exactly where she was at the top of those steps, not blocking him but not moving aside either. He stopped at the base. "I'd like to discuss the property with Mr. Carter," he said. "I have an offer I believe he'll find generous. When do you expect him back?" "He didn't leave me a specific time," Clara said. "These mountain roads can be unpredictable, I see." Holloway looked at the cabin behind her, then at the pasture to the north, then back at her with the patient smile still in place. "Well, perhaps you could get a message to him. I'd like to arrange a meeting at his earliest convenience." "I'll certainly let him know you stopped by," Clara said. Holloway nodded slowly. Then he said, in a tone that shifted just slightly, not threatening, "Not yet, but carrying the particular weight of a man reminding someone of the power differential between them, Ms. Whitfield, I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you're a capable woman. The situation with this property's documentation isn't clean. Dawson's death created some complications around the grazing rights on the southern land. I'm sure Mr. Carter is aware, and I'd hate for him to find himself in a legal position that could have been avoided with a timely conversation." Clara looked at him steadily. "That's very considerate of you," she said. "I'll make sure he knows you're concerned." A pause. Holloway looked at her, and she saw it just briefly, the recalculation happening behind his eyes. He'd expected someone easier to rattle. "Good day, Ms. Whitfield," he said. "Good day, Mr. Holloway." He remounted. The three riders turned and went back down the trail. Clara stood on the porch and watched them until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then she sat down on the porch step and let her hands shake for exactly 1 minute, because she'd been holding them steady by sheer will for the last 15 and they'd earned it. He knew about the grazing documents. That meant he'd already been to the county recorder's office. He'd already done his homework. He knew exactly what was missing. She got up and went inside and sat at the table with a blank piece of paper and wrote down everything she could remember about the conversation, every word he'd used, every pause, every carefully chosen phrase. She wrote it down in her clearest hand and set it where William would see it the moment he walked through the door. Then she went to the shelf and got the almanac and the survey book and started reading about Colorado water rights law. Because if this was going to be a fight, she was going to understand the ground they were fighting on. William came back before nightfall the next day, as he'd promised. She heard his horse on the trail and was at the door when he rode up, and she could see before he even dismounted that he'd gotten what he went for. There was something different in the way he was sitting, not relieved exactly, but settled, like a man who'd gone to face something he'd been avoiding and found it survivable. He came up the porch steps, and she held out the paper with her notes from Holloway's visit. He read it standing there. She watched his face. "He was here," William said. "Yesterday noon. 3 riders," his jaw tightened. "You were alone." "I was fine," she said. "Read the rest," he read. When he finished, he looked up at her. He mentioned the grazing documents. By implication. He was careful with his words. She paused. "Did you find them in Millerton?" William reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to her. She opened it. Inside were 3 documents, all bearing the county recorder's stamp from the day before. The grazing lease, the water right filing, and something she hadn't known to ask for, a secondary deed covering the east boundary, the one closest to Holloway's own land. She looked up. "You had all of this on file," she said. "Dawson filed it all," William said. "3 years ago. I just never had copies." He paused. "And I didn't know about the east boundary deed. The recorder found it when he pulled the full property history. Dawson must have done it without telling me." Clara looked at the east boundary deed. She looked at the dates, and then she set all 3 documents on the table and sat down and said, "William, sit down." He sat. "Holloway doesn't know about this deed," she said. "The east boundary, if this is recorded the way I think it is, it doesn't just clarify your property line, it makes his current road access to the upper valley technically a crossing of your land." William was very still. "Every time he drives cattle to market on the upper road," Clara said, "he's crossing your property, without an easement on file." The silence in the cabin had a different quality now. "That man came up here," William said slowly, "to pressure me about documentation gaps he thought I had. When in fact you hold documentation that affects him," Clara said. "Yes." A long pause. William picked up the east boundary deed and looked at it for a long time. "Dawson knew," he said quietly. He said it mostly to himself. "That old man knew exactly what he was doing when he filed this. He was protecting the property," Clara said. "He just never told you what protection he'd put in place." William set the deed down. He looked at Clara across the table. "I need a lawyer," he said. "You need a territorial land attorney," she said. "Someone who knows federal grazing law and Colorado water statute." She paused. "I wrote 3 letters while you were gone. I sent Cody down with them this morning. One to the county recorder's office to confirm filing dates. One to the territorial commissioner's office in Denver asking for the name of a qualified land attorney practicing in this district." She paused. "And one to your nearest neighboring property holder, the Garrity family. 2 valleys over asking if they'd had any dealings with Holloway and what they knew about his acquisition methods." William stared at her. "You sent letters," he said. Another long pause. "This one different from the others. Not weighted. Something lighter moving through it." "Clara," he said. "You said I was authorized," she reminded him. "I said write letters to cattle buyers. The situation expanded," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment, that long, measuring look she was Stidkagals recognize as his version of admiration, and then something happened that she hadn't expected at all. He laughed. It was short, quiet, more breath than sound. But it was real, and it changed his whole face, and she found herself smiling before she'd decided to. "All right," he said. "All right." He picked up the documents and began straightening them into a stack. "Tell me what else you've been up to while I was gone." What she'd been up to was this. She'd also gone through the storage room properly for the first time and found a box of Dawson's personal papers that nobody had moved since his death. In that box was a journal, partial and hard to read in places, but containing 6 months of daily entries about the property, the cattle, the surrounding land dealings, and critically 2 entries about Richard Holloway that described, in Dawson's blunt, unhurried handwriting, a conversation in which Holloway had offered to buy the property and been refused. Followed 6 weeks later by a visit from a county assessor Dawson had never requested, who had appeared asking unusual questions about the property's water usage. She'd read those entries 3 times. She put them in front of William when she told him. He read them quietly. She watched the line of his shoulders. She watched the point when he got to the assessor entry, and the shoulders went rigid. "He sent someone," William said. "That's what it looks like," Clara said carefully. Dawson didn't know for certain, but the timing, the questions the man was asking Dawson wrote that it felt manufactured. William set the journal down. This man sent someone to manufacture a challenge to Dawson's water rights, he said. And 6 weeks after that conversation, Dawson was dead. The words sat in the room. Dawson died of heart failure, Clara said, because she needed to say it. That's the official account. Dawson was 71 years old and worked hard every day of his life, William said. And yes, his heart gave out. I know he paused. But I also know he was being pressured, and that pressure didn't help him. Clara nodded slowly. We need that lawyer, she said. Yes, William said. We do. He looked at the journal, then at the 3 certified documents from Millerton, then at Clara's notes from Holloway's visit. He looked at all of it spread across the table like a map of something neither of them had quite understood before they'd started pulling it apart. You did all of this, he said, in a day and a half. I work fast when the situation requires it, Clara said. I noticed. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the expression she still hadn't found a complete name for, the one that was about something larger than what was happening on the surface of the conversation. Why, he said. She blinked. What? Why go to all this trouble? You've been here 11 days. You don't own a square inch of this land. You could have talked to Holloway, been pleasant, and stayed well clear of the rest. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because it's the right thing to do, she said finally. And because someone once did me the kindness of carrying my bags when I'd had a long walk and couldn't ask for help. I'm not going to pay that back by sitting on my hands while someone tries to take what he built. William looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say anything, but something changed in his face finally. Clearly, undeniably, like something that had been braced against a cold wind for a very long time and had just cautiously begun to let down its guard. The letter from the Garrity family came back 4 days later. Cody brought it up from the Valley Mail with the look of a young man who knew the envelope was important and was pleased to have been trusted with it. Clara read it first because William was out with Pete checking the north fence line, and she didn't want to wait. The letter was from a woman, Margaret Garrity, it appeared, who had written on behalf of herself and her husband, James, both of whom appeared to be in their 60s and to have a clear and detailed memory of every person who had ever offered them a price they didn't like. Holloway had approached the Garritys 18 months ago. He'd offered below market value for their east pasture. They'd declined. He'd returned 3 months later with a county assessment notice suggesting their water diversion was out of compliance. They'd hired an attorney and determined the notice was based on a measurement error, later confirmed to be deliberate in the original assessment. He does this, Margaret Garrity had written, in handwriting that pressed hard into the paper, the way a woman's writing does when she is choosing restraint over what she'd actually prefer to say. He finds the gap in your documentation, manufactures a legal problem around it, and then offers to make the problem go away if you sell. He has done this to 3 families in this valley that we know of. 2 of them sold, we did not, but it cost us considerable trouble and money to resist him. If Mr. Carter is facing the same, tell him he is not alone in it. And tell him Margaret Garrity says to get himself a lawyer yesterday. Clara read the letter twice. Then she got up and walked out to the north fence line. William and Pete were restringing wire at the far end. She walked the whole distance and held out the letter when she got there. And he read it leaning against a fence post with his hat pushed back and his forearms still dusty from the work. Pete, who was not subtle, found somewhere else to be. 3 families, William said. At minimum, Clara said. That she knows of. He folded the letter. He's done this before and gotten away with it, he said. Yes, which means he knows how. Yes, she said again. William looked out across the north pasture. His cattle were moving slowly in the afternoon heat. The way cattle did when they were comfortable and unhurried and unaware that their home was being circled. The letters to Denver, he said. The attorney referral. Has anything come back yet? Could be another week. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, You've been running this like it's your fight. Clara looked at him. Someone has to, she said. Clara, I'm not looking for thanks. William, I'm telling you the situation. I know what you're telling me. He turned to face her. I'm telling you I see what you're doing, and I see why. He paused. And I'm asking you, is this what you want? Because this is going to get harder before it gets easier. Holloway isn't going to accept a quiet legal answer. Men like him don't. And I don't want you in the middle of something you walked into by accident and never agreed to. Clara held his gaze. She thought about her father's kitchen table, about the page he turned without looking up, about $32 in split-toe boots and a mile and a half she'd walked because there was nowhere else to go. I have been in the middle of difficult situations for most of my life, she said. The difference is that this time, I'm in the middle of it on my own terms. Standing on ground I help secure, next to someone who actually looks at me when I talk. She paused. Don't try to give me a way out, William. I don't want one. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was on his face, and the breeze was moving through the pasture, and somewhere in the upper tree line a hawk was calling out. Long and clean and definitive. All right, he said. Just that. But the way he said it was different from all the other times he'd said all right, which had meant agreed or fine or proceed as you see fit. This one meant something else. This one meant I believe you. The reply from Denver came 8 days later. Not from the commissioner's office, but directly from a land attorney named Samuel Reese, who appeared to have received Clara's letter and decided to respond personally. He was brief, precise, and clearly unimpressed with Holloway's methods, which he described in legal language that boiled down to: this was a known pattern, and he had handled similar cases before, and if they wished to retain him, he could be at the property within the fortnight. Clara read the letter to William at supper. When she finished, he pushed back from the table and said, "Write him back. Tell him yes." "Already did," she said, "this morning." He looked at her. "The stagecoach leaves Ridgeline on Tuesdays," she said. "Today's Monday. I wanted it to go out first thing." He sat with that for a moment. "Clara," he said. "I know. I should asked. I wasn't going to say that. Then what were you going to say?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, that same slow rotation she'd noticed the first morning. The one that meant he was working toward something he didn't know exactly how to say. "I was going to say," he said, "that I've been running this ranch alone for 3 years, and in 2 weeks, you've done more than I managed in all of that time. And I'm not sure what to do with that." She looked at him. "You don't have to do anything with it," she said. "It's just true." He looked at the table, then at her. Then away. "I had a wife," he said, 7 years ago. She left. Clara said nothing. She waited. "Not because I was unkind to her," he said carefully, "but because I wasn't easy to be with. I kept things to myself. I didn't know how to let someone in." He paused. She said she felt like she was talking to a wall. She wasn't wrong. "You're not talking to a wall right now," Clara said quietly. "No," he said. She waited again. "I don't want to make promises I'm not sure of," he said. "That's not who I am. I say things I mean or I don't say them." He looked up at her directly. "But I want you to know that what you've done here, what you're doing, it matters. You matter. Not because you're useful. Because he stopped. Searched. Because you see things clearly and you act on what you see. And I don't know many people who do both." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not sharp. Something slower. The way ice shifts in early spring, almost imperceptible. But irreversible. "My father called me a burden for most of my adult life," she said. "I believed him for longer than I should have." "He was wrong," William said. "I know that now. Did you know it when you walked up this trail?" She thought about that honestly. "I was starting to," she said. "But I needed somewhere to stand while I finished figuring it out." He nodded slowly. "Then stay," he said. "Not because of Holloway. Not because of the books or the letters or any of it. Stay because," stopped again. and she could see the effort it cost him. This man who said things only when he meant them, working to find the right ones. Because I'd like to know what it feels like to have someone in this cabin who isn't just passing through. The fire in the cook stove ticked quietly. Outside, the mountain was settling into the long blue dusk of a Colorado summer evening. Clara looked at William Carter, this silent, careful, complicated man who carried poetry books and laughed with his whole face when he forgot to hold it back, and had spent 3 years sleeping in a one-room cabin on land that was, it turned out, considerably more valuable than he'd let anyone see. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He nodded once. And then he got up and poured them both more coffee and sat back down, and they really talked. For the first time about the property, and the cattle, and Dawson, and Margaret Garrity, and Samuel Reese, the land attorney. But also about other things. About the poetry book and why he'd started reading it. About her mother's Bible and what was written in the margins. About what it was like to grow up in a house where you were counted instead of known. They talked until the fire burned low, and when Clara finally said goodnight and went to the storage room and lay down on her cot, she put her hand on her mother's Bible in the dark and thought that for the first time since she'd packed it into her bag on that last night in Hatcher's Creek, she didn't need to hold on to it like a lifeline. She could just hold it. Because she was already somewhere solid. But what she didn't know, what neither of them knew, lying awake in their separate rooms, listening to the summer night move through the mountains, was that Richard Holloway had not gone home. He had ridden to town, and in the morning Cody would come up the trail with his hat in his hands and his face pale. And he would tell them what Holloway had done, and the ground they'd worked so hard to stand on would begin, very suddenly, to shift. Cody came up the trail at a run. That was the first thing wrong. Cody never ran. He was a young man of 20 with easy habits and an unhurried disposition. The kind of person who moved at the pace of whatever needed doing and no faster. So when Clara heard boots hitting the ground fast and looked up from the ledger to see him coming through the trees at something close to a sprint, she was already on her feet and at the door before he reached the porch steps. His face told her it was bad before his mouth did. "Mr. Carter," he said, breathing hard. "Is Mr. Carter here?" "He's in the barn." What happened? Cody pulled his hat off. He looked at her. Then at the ground, then back at her with the expression of a young man who had been handed news too heavy for him and needed to set it down somewhere. "Holloway filed a claim," he said, "yesterday afternoon. Down at the county recorder's office in Millerton." Clara went very still. "What kind of claim?" "Adverse possession. On the South Meadow." Cody twisted his hat in both hands. "Pete heard it from the liveryman in Ridgeline this morning. Said Holloway rode into Millerton with 3 witnesses and an attorney and filed papers, claiming the South Meadow land has been in continuous use by his cattle for the past 7 years. Not, Mr. Carter said. The grazing lease was invalid because Dawson wasn't the legal title holder when he signed it. That's not true, Clara said. No, ma'am, but he filed it, and the recorder accepted the filing. Clara turned and walked to the barn. William was repairing a bridle when she came in. He took one look at her face and put the bridle down. She told him. She watched him absorb it. She watched his jaw set and his eyes go to a middle distance and come back. She watched him work through it, the way he worked through everything from the inside out. Quietly, arriving at something solid before he spoke. Adverse possession, he said. 7-year claim. 3 witnesses. His witnesses, she confirmed. And an attorney who knew exactly what he was filing and when. William was quiet. He moved fast, he said. He moved fast because we moved fast, Clara said. He came up here and saw that I wasn't rattled and went straight to Millerton. He couldn't wait for a negotiation once he knew we had our documents in order. She paused. He's trying to get ahead of Samuel Reese. William picked up the bridle again, then set it back down. When does Reese arrive? He said within the fortnight. That was 8 days ago, so 6 days at the most, if he travels as planned. Yes, And in 6 days, Holloway's filing becomes part of the official county record. And even if Reese can fight it, it becomes a lengthy legal process instead of a clean. William stopped. He put both hands flat on the top of the stall gate and stood there for a moment with his weight on his arms. What does the filing give him practically? Right now? Today? Clara had already thought about this. Access, she said. If he can demonstrate to a territorial judge that the South Meadow is under active contested ownership, he can petition for a provisional grazing order that gives him access to that land while the case is decided. Which means his cattle on your meadow. Which means your cattle displaced. Which means your herd loses weight and condition going into fall auction. She paused. And which means your operating costs go up precisely when your revenue goes down. William looked at her. He wants to squeeze me, he said. He wants to make holding on more expensive than selling, Clara said. Yes, that's exactly what he wants. The barn was quiet around them. One of the horses shifted. Outside she could hear the cattle in the north pasture and the wind in the high pines. All right, William said. He straightened up. We need to get to Millerton, both of us? He looked at her directly. You know those documents better than I do. And you've read Dawson's journal. And you write letters that get lawyers out of Denver in under 10 days. He held her gaze. Yes, both of us. They left within the hour. Clara changed into her better dress, which was not significantly better than her everyday dress, but had fewer mended places at the cuffs, and braided her hair and put on her hat, and met William at the front of the cabin with her small traveling bag and the envelope of certified documents tucked inside her coat. He had the horses ready. He handed her the reins of a gray mare named Ellen, who was calm and smooth-gaited, and apparently chosen with some consideration, because she was easier to ride for long distances than the others. Clara noticed that. She didn't say anything. She mounted and they rode. Cody watched them from the porch with the expression of a young man left in charge of something too big for him and determined not to let that show. Don't let anyone pass the gate, William told him. Yes, sir. And if Holloway comes back, I'll tell him you're away on business, Cody said. Same as Miss Clara told him. William looked at the young man for a moment. Something like approval in his eyes. Good, he said. They rode, 2 hours into the mountain road. Clara said, tell me about the South Meadow. William rode beside her. Not ahead of her, which she noticed. What about it? How long have your cattle been grazing there? 4 years. Since I came to the property. And before that, it was open range. Nobody had a formal claim on it before Dawson leased it. So Holloway's claim that his cattle have been there 7 years is impossible, William said flatly. My cattle have been on that meadow for 4 years, and Dawson's before that. Holloway's land doesn't border the meadow directly. He'd have had to drive his herd 3 miles across someone else's property to get there. Would the Garrities know that? William glanced at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Margaret Garrity wrote a letter that suggests she's been watching them very carefully for at least 18 months. And I'm thinking if Holloway drove cattle across the Garrity land to access the South Meadow even once, even briefly, she'd know it, and she'd remember it. A pause. And a witness who can testify that Holloway's cattle were never regularly in that meadow, William said slowly. Undercuts the adverse possession claim at its foundation, Clara finished. You need continuous uncontested use for 7 years. One credible witness who can swear that's not what happened changes the entire case. William was quiet for a moment. You want to ride to the Garrities, he said. It's 2 valleys over. We can stop on the way back from Millerton. She paused. If they're willing. Margaret Garrity signed her letter, William said, with her full name, and told us to get a lawyer yesterday. Something close to a smile moved through his expression. I think she's willing. Millerton was a proper town bigger than Ridgeline, with a courthouse square and a land office and 3 hotels along the main street. Clara had never been there. She looked at it steadily as they rode in, noting the county recorder's office on the north side of the square. the sheriff's office beside it, and the attorney's shingle 2 doors down that read Bartholomew Crane. Yesk, land and property law. William tied the horses at the post in front of the recorder's office. I want to see the actual filing, Clara said. Whatever Holloway submitted. We have the right to view any public county record. I know that. Good. Because the recorder may try to discourage us. William looked at her. Have you done this before, he said. No, she said. But I've read enough county filings to know how they work. And I know that a recorder who accepted a fraudulent claim is going to be uncomfortable seeing the people that claim targets walk through his door. She was right. The county recorder was a thin man named Aldous Webb, with the posture of someone who had spent too long at a desk and the expression of someone currently wishing he was at a different desk in a different county. He recognized William's name before William finished introducing himself, which meant Holloway had been thorough enough in his filing to ensure the recorder would. Mr. Carter Webb said carefully, I understand you may have some questions about a recent filing. I'd like to see it, William said. These matters can be sensitive. It's a public record, Clara said pleasantly. We'd like to review it at your convenience, Mr. Webb. We have all afternoon. Webb looked at her. She smiled. He got the file. They read it standing at the counter, side by side. Clara went through it with methodical speed, turning pages and tracking references, and making notes in the small notebook she'd started carrying in her coat pocket after the second week at the ranch. The filing was well constructed. That was the first thing she acknowledged to herself. Holloway had a good attorney, someone who knew exactly which legal language to use and which precedents to cite, and how to make 7 years of fictional history look like documented fact. But there were problems. 3 witnesses. She wrote down their names. 2 of them she didn't know. The third was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had been listed in Pete's old receipts as a former hired hand on Holloway's property. The survey used to define the South Meadow boundaries in Holloway's claim was dated 3 months ago. But the survey she had in her envelope, the one from Dawson's original lease filing, was dated 4 years prior. And the boundaries didn't match. Holloway's survey had moved the meadow's eastern edge by approximately 40 feet. 40 feet. She pointed it out to William without speaking, just touching the relevant line on each document. He looked. He straightened up slowly. He redrew the boundary, William said. Very quietly. Enough to put the existing water trough on the contested side, Clara said. Equally quiet, which means if his provisional access claim succeeds, he controls your herd's primary summer water source. William's hand closed on the edge of the counter. Can I make notes from this? Clara asked Webb, who was hovering at a discreet distance. It's public record, Webb said, in the tone of a man trying to be technically cooperative while being personally miserable about it. Thank you, she said, and wrote down everything she needed. When they walked out, William said nothing until they were clear of the building. Then he said, low and deliberate, he didn't just file an adverse possession claim. No, Clara said. He filed a claim designed to take the water, yes, without the South Meadow water. I moved the herd to the north pasture through August. They come out of summer lighter than they should be. Fall auction price drops, and your operating costs for next spring go up because underweight cattle need more feed to recover, Clara said. And if that pattern repeats for 2 or 3 seasons, the math stops working, William said. Yes. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. This man has done this before, William said. To the Garrity's. To the others Margaret mentioned. He has done this over and over in this valley, and he knows exactly how long it takes to break a person down. Yes, Clara said. He thought I'd be easier. No wife, no family nearby. A property with documentation gaps. He paused. He didn't expect you. Clara looked at him. He didn't expect us, she said. William looked back at her. In the middle of the Millerton Courthouse Square, in the June heat, with the noise of the town around them and a fraudulent land claim filed against everything he'd built. No, he said. He didn't. They found Bartholomew Crane 2 doors down. He was not what Clara expected from a small-town land attorney. He was 50-something, broad through the chest, with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead and the unhurried confidence of a man who had won more cases than he'd lost and knew why. He listened to everything they had to say. He reviewed the documents Clara had brought. He looked at her notes from Holloway's filing. He asked good questions. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair and said, "The boundary discrepancy is your best argument. 40 feet on a survey document is either incompetence or fraud. And whoever Holloway's surveyor is, I know who can verify the original stakes." He picked up Clara's note page. These witnesses. Fitch worked for Holloway for 8 years. The other two, Harrison and Cole, they're not local to this district. Which means he brought them in. Brought them in specifically for this filing? William asked. It's not illegal to use witnesses from outside the district, Crane said. But it's unusual, and unusual things raise questions in front of a judge. He set the paper down. The bigger problem is the timeline. He filed yesterday. A provisional access petition could come before the district judge as early as next week. If you want to oppose it formally, you need to file a counter-response by Friday. Today is Tuesday, Clara said. Yes, ma'am. Can we file by Friday? Crane looked at her over his spectacles in the way of a man recalibrating who he was actually talking to. With the boundary survey discrepancy documented and a counter-affidavit from the property owner. Yes, he said. If you also have a witness who can testify to the actual historical use of the South Meadow, that would strengthen the counter-response considerably. We may have one, Clara said. The Garrity family, 2 valleys over. Crane's eyebrows went up slightly. James and Margaret Garrity? You know them? I represented them against a water compliance notice 18 months ago, Crane said. And then he smiled slowly, with the satisfaction of a man seeing a pattern complete itself. Let me guess. The notice originated from a county assessor who appeared without being requested, asked questions about water usage, and then filed a compliance concern that turned out to be based on a measurement error. That's what Margaret Garrity's letter describes, Clara said. Crane put his hands flat on the desk. That assessor's name is Horace Gideon, he said. He is not a county employee. He is a private consultant. And the last 3 times his name has appeared in a county filing in this district. Richard Holloway has been the party who benefited. He looked at William. Mr. Carter, you are not facing a land dispute. You are facing a coordinated acquisition strategy that has been operating in this valley for at least 2 years. The room was very quiet. Can you prove that? William asked. Not yet, Crane said. But the pattern is provable, and patterns presented to the right judge become evidence. He picked up his pen. I'll draft the counter-response today. You go to the Garritys and get me a signed affidavit about the South Meadows historical use. And I'll send a message to Samuel Reese in Denver if he's coming to this district. I want him to know what he's walking into. You know Reese, Clara asked. We've worked opposing sides of 2 cases, Crane said. He's excellent. Between the 2 of us, Mr. Carter, I believe we can not only defeat Holloway's provisional petition, but make the filing of it the worst decision that man has made in this valley. For the first time since Cody had come up the trail at a run that morning, Clara felt the tight band across her chest begin to ease. Slightly, just slightly, because she had learned not to breathe easy before the thing was done. But slightly. The Garritys lived in a low, wide ranch house in a valley that sat below the Carter property like a cupped hand. Margaret Garrity was waiting on the porch when they rode up, which meant someone from Millerton had already gotten word to her. Which meant either that her network of information was extraordinary, or that Holloway had made more enemies than he realized. Possibly both. She was a stout woman of 60-something, with gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that had the particular sharpness of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms correctly and acting on what she found. She looked at William, then at Clara. She looked at Clara for a long moment. You're the woman who sent the letter, she said. Yes. Ma'am, Clara said. Whitfield. Margaret turned it over. You're not Carter's wife. No. I manage his books and correspondence. Another long look. The kind that was making a decision. Get down, Margaret said. Both of you. James is in the back. I'll get him. There's coffee inside, and I imagine you've had a day. They had coffee. They told her everything, the adverse possession filing, the boundary discrepancy, the outside witnesses, Crane's assessment. All of it. James Garrity joined them halfway through. A quiet man with weathered hands and the listening quality of someone who understood that his wife would handle the talking and his job was to confirm it. When Clara finished, Margaret sat back and said, Fitch. That man's name was in my statement to Bartholomew Crane 18 months ago. He came onto our property claiming to be a surveyor checking an adjacent boundary. James ran him off. And 2 weeks later we got the compliance notice. He was scouting, William said. He was scouting, Margaret agreed. And now he's signing affidavits. She looked at James. James nodded once. We'll give you the affidavit, Margaret said. I'll go further than that. I'll appear in person if the judge calls a hearing. She pointed at Clara. You write up what you need me to say, and I'll say it under oath. And I want you to know something else. What? Clara asked. Margaret leaned forward. The family that sold to Holloway 18 months ago, she said. The Hendersons. Their boy is still in this valley, working a hired hand position over on the Dutton spread. He was too young when his father sold, and he has always blamed himself for not finding a way to stop it. She paused. He knows what Holloway did to his family. He knows it in detail. And he's been waiting for someone to give him a reason to say so on the record. Clara looked at William. William looked at Clara. Can you get word to him? Clara said. By tomorrow morning, Margaret said. They rode back to the Carter ranch in the last light, pushing the horses a little faster than was comfortable because neither of them wanted to leave Cody alone, another night with Holloway potentially on the road. An hour from home, William said, You know what's going to happen when Holloway finds out about Crane. Yes, Clara said. He's going to come back here. Not with lawyers. Not with filings. I know. He's going to try to make this personal. He already has, Clara said. The moment he manufactured those witnesses, this stopped being a legal dispute and became something else. William rode beside her in silence for a moment. Clara, he said. I'm not backing down, she said. Don't ask me to. I wasn't going to, he said. I was going to say that when he comes, and he will come, I need you to stay behind me. She looked at him. Not because you can't handle yourself, he said quickly. You've proven that. But because men like Holloway say things when they're cornered. Things they calculate to hit the hardest. And I don't want he stopped. Tried again. I don't want you standing in front of that alone. Something moved through her chest that she didn't quite have a name for. All right, she said quietly. He nodded. They rode on. Holloway came on Thursday morning. Not alone. Never alone. He brought his attorney, a man named Voss who wore a city suit and had the kind of clipped, precise manner that meant he billed by the hour and knew it. He brought 2 other men Clara recognized from his first visit. And he brought one person she hadn't expected, the county sheriff. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a man of 50, with a badge that looked newer than it should have, given how long he'd apparently held the position. He hung at the back of the group, with the particular discomfort of a man being used in a way he wasn't entirely at peace with. Clara noticed that. William came off the porch to meet them. Clara came with him, and she stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, which was not behind him, and he didn't argue with it. Holloway looked at them both. His smile this time had the fixed quality of something prepared in advance. Carter, he said. I was hoping we could have a straightforward conversation before this situation becomes more complicated than it needs to be. It's already complicated, William said. You made it that way. Holloway spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable openness. A legal filing is simply a clarification of rights. Nothing personal. You falsified a survey, William said. Holloway's attorney, Voss, spoke immediately. My client filed a legally compliant claim based on documentation. The survey boundary does not match the original recorded survey by 40 feet, Clara said. Her voice was steady and clear. We have both documents. The discrepancy is not a measurement variance. It is a redrawing. Voss looked at her for the first time. He had the look of a man recalibrating. And the witnesses you used, Clara continued. One of whom is your client's former employee, two of whom are from outside this district and have no documented history in this valley. We've provided that information to Bartholomew Crane, who is filing our counter-response today. Holloway stopped smiling. Crane, he said. He said to tell you he knows who Horace Gideon is, Clara said. And what his name appears alongside in the county filing record. The silence that followed was sharp. Sheriff Pruitt, at the back of the group, shifted his weight and looked at the ground. Holloway looked at Clara with an expression she recognized. She had seen it before in her father's eyes, in the eyes of men at auction who'd underestimated her. In the eyes of anyone who had made the mistake of assuming that a quiet woman was an empty one. It was the expression of a man understanding, too late, that he had miscalculated. A lonely man like Carter doesn't need someone to run his correspondence, Holloway said. His voice had changed, quieter, colder, calculated. What exactly is your arrangement here, Miss Whitfield? Because I'd hate for there to be any questions about the legitimacy of documents filed by someone with an unclear standing on this property. There it was. Clara felt William shift beside her. She knew, without looking, that he was about to speak. She spoke first. My standing is that of an authorized agent of the property owner, she said. In writing, dated and witnessed. She had made William sign that authorization on their first full morning after he'd left for Millerton. She had known she might need it. Every letter I've written, every filing I've authorized, every document I've handled is legally attributable to Mr. Carter's express authority. She paused. As for what I am to Mr. Carter, that's not your business, Mr. Holloway, and it has no bearing on the law. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at William. You can't hold this property, he said. And the pleasantness was entirely gone now. The South Meadow claim will be in front of a judge before the end of the month. And when it is, you'll find that the legal costs of fighting it are considerably more than the cost of simply accepting my offer. What is your offer? William asked. Holloway named a figure. It was below market value. Significantly below. No, William said. Holloway's jaw tightened. That isn't the answer that serves you best, Voss said from behind him. It's the only answer I have, William said. This land isn't for sale. Everything is for sale, Holloway said. The only question is what price makes a man practical. Then we don't have anything else to talk about today, William said. He turned and walked back to the porch, not rushing, not dismissive, just done. Clara stayed for exactly one more second, looking at Richard Holloway, this man who had broken 3 families in this valley, who had manufactured evidence and bought witnesses and used the law like a weapon against the people it was supposed to protect. She looked at Sheriff Pruitt, who was still looking at the ground. Sheriff, she said. He looked up. She held his eyes for a long moment. Mr. Crane is filing our counter-response today, she said quietly. And Samuel Reese arrives from Denver within the week. When the full pattern of filings in this district comes before a federal judge, and it will, the names on record matter. She glanced at Holloway. Then back to Pruitt. Whose name is on which side of that record is still a choice. Pruitt said nothing. But she saw at something behind his eyes, a small, uncomfortable movement of a conscience that wasn't entirely dead. She turned and went back to the porch. William was standing at the top of the steps. He said nothing, but when she came up beside him, he put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Just a second. Just a touch, the way you touch something to confirm it's real and solid and where you expected it to be. Then he dropped his hand. They watched Holloway and his men ride back down the trail. When they were gone, Clara sat down on the top porch step. William sat beside her. "Pruitt is wavering," she said. "I saw. If he decides Holloway isn't worth his reputation, it changes what the judge sees when this goes to hearing," William said. "Yes." They sat quietly for a moment. "You said we'd have Reese within the week," William said. "And Crane is filing today, and the Garrity affidavit and Henderson statement are in Crane's hands by tomorrow," Clara said. "Cody took my letter to Margaret this morning." William turned to look at her. "You wrote the letter before. We knew the hearing was this month," he said. "I wrote it before we rode to Millerton," she said. "I knew we'd need it. I just didn't know how soon." He stared at her. "Clara," he said, and then he stopped, because there were apparently things he still didn't know how to say. And she was beginning to understand that for William Carter, the pause before the words was the most honest part. "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked down the trail where Holloway had gone. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "But we're not where we were this morning," she paused. "And we're not where we were 3 weeks ago." William nodded slowly. Then Cody came around the side of the cabin with 2 cups of coffee and a look of enormous relief at seeing Holloway gone and the porch not on fire. And he held out the cups with both hands and said, "Figured you might need these, ma'am." "Sir." Clara took hers. She wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth of it go through her palms and thought about the letter, still in transit to Margaret Garrity, and Bartholomew Crane at his desk in Millerton, and Samuel Reese somewhere on the Denver road getting closer with every hour. She thought about 40 feet on a survey map. She thought about a man named Henderson who had been waiting for a reason. She thought about Sheriff Pruitt's eyes when she'd said whose name is on which side of that record is still a choice. She drank her coffee, and somewhere below on the mountain road, Richard Holloway was riding back to wherever he'd come from, but Clara knew, with the certainty of someone who had learned to read situations clearly, that a man like that didn't take no for an answer. He would come back, and when he did, he would not come with lawyers. He would come with something worse. Samuel Reese arrived on a Saturday. Clara heard the horse before she saw the rider, and she was already at the door when he came up the trail, a tall man of about 55, with a leather satchel across his shoulder and the unhurried bearing of someone who had ridden long distances enough, times that the distance itself no longer impressed him. He wore a good coat gone soft at the elbows and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had spent 30 years being the smartest person in rooms full of people who hadn't expected it. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Clara in the doorway. He looked at William, coming around from the side of the building. "Carter," he said. "Reese," William said. "You made good time. Your situation didn't suggest I should dawdle." He dismounted and handed his reins to Cody, who appeared as if conjured. Then he looked back at Clara. "And you must be Miss Whitfield. Your letter was the most organized account of a property dispute I've received in the last decade. Bartholomew Crane sends his compliments, and also this." He reached into the satchel and produced a folded document. Clara took it. She read the first paragraph and looked up. "The counter-response was accepted," she said. "Filed Wednesday," Reese said. "The judge has set a preliminary hearing for the 14th, which gives us 9 days." He stepped up onto the porch and looked at William with the direct, measuring quality of a man who did not waste time on pleasantness he didn't mean. "I need to see everything, every document, every letter, every piece of correspondence, and I need to know what you haven't told me yet." William held his gaze. "Come inside," he said. They spread everything across the table. All of it. The original deed, the grazing lease, the water right filing. The east boundary deed Dawson had filed without telling William. Clara's notes from Holloway's first visit, the certified copies from Millerton. Crane's counter-response, Margaret Garrity's signed affidavit, which had arrived by Cody 2 days prior, 4 pages of precise, dated recollection, written in Margaret's hard-pressing hand. The preliminary statement from Thomas Henderson, Dawson's old journal, with the relevant entries marked. Reese went through it all, with the systematic speed of someone reading a language he was fluent in. He asked questions while he read, not pausing for answers but registering them, building a picture the way Clara had learned to build a ledger from the outside edges in. When he finished, he sat back and said, "The East Boundary Deed." "Yes," William said. "You didn't know Dawson filed this?" "No. He never mentioned it." "He never mentioned a lot of things," William said. "He was a quiet man. He handled what needed handling and told you afterward." "If at all." Reese turned the deed over in his hands. "This deed," he said carefully, "does not merely clarify the eastern boundary. It establishes a prescriptive easement reversal on the upper road." He looked up. "Do you know what that means?" Clara explained the road crossing, William said. "Then she told you that Holloway's primary cattle route to the upper market road crosses your land without a recorded easement." Reese set the deed down. "But what that also means is this: if Holloway has been using that road for commercial purposes, which he has, for at least 4 years he has been doing so on your property. Without compensation. Without," he paused. "Under territorial law, you have the basis for a counterclaim. Not just a defense of the South Meadow. An affirmative claim against Holloway for unauthorized commercial use of your land." The table was very quiet. "We can go after him," Clara said. "Carefully," Reese said. "And strategically. And not in a way that looks like retaliation. Because judges don't like retaliation, and Holloway's attorney will use it if we're clumsy." He looked at William. "But yes, if we handle this correctly, you don't just survive his adverse possession claim. You put him in a position where continuing to operate in this valley costs him more than it cost you." William sat with that for a long moment. Clara watched him work through it, the same inside-out process she'd seen since the first morning. But now she knew the shape of it well enough to see when he arrived at something solid. "What do you need from me?" William asked. "I need to know your full financial position," Reese said. "Not the operating budget. The total picture. What this property is worth. What the herd is worth. What the water rights are worth." A pause. Clara looked at William. William looked at the table. "There's something you need to tell him," Clara said quietly. William looked at her. She held his gaze, not pushing. Just steady. The way she'd learned was the most useful thing she could offer him. He turned back to Reese. "The property is worth considerably more than it appears," William said. Reese's expression didn't change. "Define considerably." William reached behind him to the shelf where the almanac lived. He moved the almanac. Behind it, not with the legal documents but set apart in its own place, was a second leather envelope Clara had never seen him open. He set it on the table. Reese looked at it, then at William. "Open it," William said. Reese opened it. Inside were documents. Not the modest deed and lease papers of the visible Carter operation. These were something else entirely. A territorial land grant. A water company incorporation charter from 8 years prior. A banking correspondence from a Denver institution. A property valuation conducted 2 years ago that made Reese go very still. He read for a full 3 minutes without speaking. Clara, who had not known about this envelope, stayed completely still and watched William and understood that whatever was in those papers, it was the thing she had sensed from the beginning, the closed door behind the closed door. The thing that explained why a man with this much capability was living in a one-room cabin on a mountain. "Carter," Reese said, slowly, "this property is not a small cattle operation." "No," William said. "The South Meadow and the North Pasture together, that's less than a third of the total land you hold under this grant. Behind this ridge." Reese touched the map that had come out of the envelope. "There is a valley, and in that valley there is a herd," William said. "And a ranch house, and a bunkhouse, and the primary water diversion for this entire section of the mountain." Clara turned and looked at him fully. He was looking at her, not at Reese, not at the papers. At her. "William," she said. "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I needed to know," he said. Whether it mattered. The room was very quiet. Reese had the particular stillness of a professional who understood that he had just walked into the middle of something that was not about property law and had the sense to let it finish. Whether what mattered, Clara asked. Whether the man I was without it was worth staying for. He held her gaze. My father left me that valley. The cattle, the water rights, the grant, all of it. He died when I was 29 and left me more than I'd known what to do with. And the first year I had it, 3 women expressed an interest in me that they had never expressed before. And 2 men who'd called me a poor ranch hand to my face appeared at the house offering partnerships. He paused. So I moved into the cabin, the small one. I told people I was a hired hand. I said the property was Dawson's. He looked at his hands. And I waited to see who would look at me like I was worth something when there was nothing else to see. Clara sat very still. She thought about her father calling her a burden. She thought about being sent away with 2 bags full of things nobody wanted. She thought about $32 and split-toe suits and the 1.5 miles up a mountain trail, and a man who had picked up her bags without saying a word. You were doing the same thing I was, she said quietly. He looked at her. I was trying to find out if I had value when nothing was attached to it, she said. So were you. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had been building for a month every morning, coffee and shared, ledgered conversation that had gone longer than either of them had planned. Every moment when he'd looked at her and she'd known she was being seen and not assessed. Every small, deliberate act that had nothing to do with property or strategy or usefulness. Reese cleared his throat gently. This changes the case considerably, he said. In your favor, substantially. He tapped the valuation document. Holloway has no idea what he's actually been trying to take. No, William said, pulling his attention back across the table. He thinks he's pushing a struggling cattle operation into a corner. Instead, he's provoked a territorial land grant holder into a counterclaim that could expose his entire acquisition pattern in this district. Reese allowed himself a small, precise smile. I have tried cases against men like Holloway before. They rely on their targets not knowing their own strength. He looked at Clara, then at William. You know yours. The next 6 days moved fast. Reese worked from the cabin table from dawn until past dark, building the counterclaim with the methodical intensity of a man who understood that every hour mattered. Clara worked beside him, cross-referencing documents, drafting correspondence, organizing the evidence timeline that showed not just Holloway's actions against the Carter property, but the full pattern across the valley. The Garrity's, the Hendersons, the false assessor visits, the manufactured compliance notices, the outside witnesses. On Monday, Thomas Henderson arrived. He was 23 years old, lean and sun-weathered, with the eyes of someone who had been carrying guilt for 2 years and had learned to live with the weight of it without letting it show. He sat at the table across from Reese and Clara and told his story in the flat, careful tone of someone who had rehearsed it to keep the emotion from getting in the way. His father had owned 40 acres in the lower valley. Holloway had approached him with an offer. His father had declined. Within 2 months, a county assessor, Horace Gideon, had appeared with a water diversion compliance notice that, according to the notice, required either a costly system modification or a significant fine. His father, facing that cost on top of a difficult season, had agreed to sell. The sale price had been below market. The compliance issue had quietly disappeared after the deed transferred. Thomas had been 17. He'd watched his father sign the papers and not known how to stop it. The compliance notice, Clara said. Did your father keep a copy? Thomas reached into his shirt and produced a folded paper, soft at the creases from being carried a long time. Clara took it. She looked at the signature at the bottom of the notice. Horace Gideon, County Assessment Authority. She passed it to Reese. Reese looked at it. Then he turned to his satchel and produced a document from the Garrity case. He set them side by side. The signature was identical. The official stamp was identical. The county authority listed was identical. And the county authority listed did not exist. He created a fictional county office, Reese said. Not loudly, quietly, in the way a person says something that is both obvious and devastating. There is no county assessment authority in this district. There never has been. Gideon wasn't acting as a county official. He was acting as a private agent using forged government credentials. The room went completely still. That's not a civil matter, William said. No, Reese said. That is fraud. Criminal fraud. Against multiple property owners over multiple years. He set both documents down carefully. We are no longer simply defending your South Meadow. Carter, we are sitting on evidence of a criminal conspiracy. Clara looked at William. He was looking at Thomas Henderson. Your father lost his land to a forged document, William said. Thomas nodded once. Type. I'm sorry, William said. Simply, directly, without qualification. That shouldn't have happened. Thomas looked at him for a moment. Something in the young man's face shifted, the practiced flatness cracking. Just slightly, around the edges. Can we get it back? Thomas asked. His land. Reese looked at the documents, then at William. If the original transfer was executed under fraudulent coercion, Reese said carefully, there may be grounds for nullification of that sale. It would require a separate action and a sympathetic judge. But the evidence we have, he tapped the 2 compliance notices, could support it. Then we add it, William said. Carter, that's a significant expansion of we add it, William said. Reese looked at him for a moment. All right, he said. Clara felt something happen in her chest, something warm and certain, and not entirely small. She had known William Carter was a good man. She had catalogued the evidence of it in the same careful way she catalogued ledger entries and survey discrepancies. But watching him look at a 23-year-old boy who had lost his father's land and say we add it without hesitation, that was different from knowing. That was seeing. She turned back to the documents and kept working. On Wednesday, Sheriff Pruitt rode up the trail alone. No Holloway, no Voss, no riders. Just the sheriff. By himself, on a horse that looked like it had been pushing hard. William went to meet him. Clara stood in the doorway. Pruitt dismounted. He held his hat in his hands, which was not the posture of a man arriving with authority. Carter, he said. I need to talk to you. Talk, William said. Pruitt looked at his hat, then up. I've been sheriff in this district for 6 years, he said. And in 6 years I have allowed myself to be. He stopped. Started again. Holloway has done favors for me, budget favors. Political favors. The kind that are hard to return and harder to ignore when he asks for something back. He paused. I knew the assessment notices were irregular. I knew Gideon wasn't county staff. I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. William said nothing. The Henderson sale, Pruitt said. I was present when Gideon served that notice. I didn't verify his credentials. I should have. He looked up directly. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here because I talked to Bartholomew Crane 2 days ago about what's going in front of the judge on the 14th. And I understand now that if this comes out fully, and it's going to come out fully, I need to be on the right side of it before it does. Clara came down off the porch. Are you willing to make a statement? She asked. Pruitt looked at her. Yes, he said. About what you know regarding Gideon's false credentials? Yes. About your presence at the Henderson notice services? A pause. Harder. Yes, he said. You understand that statement will be used in a legal proceeding that could result in criminal charges against Holloway, Clara said. And that it will reflect on your own conduct during this period. I understand, Pruitt said. I've already written to the Territorial Commissioner's office. I'm submitting my resignation effective the end of the month. He put his hat back on. I'm not looking for credit. I don't want more people to lose what the Hendersons lost. Not if I can stop it. William looked at him for a long moment. Come inside, William said. Reese needs to hear this from you directly. Reese took Pruitt's statement in writing and had him sign it that afternoon. When Pruitt left, Reese sat for a long moment with the signed document in his hands and the particular expression of a man holding a card he hadn't expected to draw. A sitting sheriff's testimony about forged government credentials, he said. Former, William said. He resigned, which actually makes him more credible. Not less. He has nothing to protect. Reese set the statement down. Carter, this case, when it goes before the judge on the 14th, is no longer a property dispute. It is the unraveling of a coordinated criminal fraud operation. Holloway's attorney will know that the moment he reads our counterfiling. He paused. And when he knows it, he will go to Holloway, and Holloway will have a choice. What choice? William asked. To fight it in court, where the evidence we have makes the outcome highly uncertain for him. Or to settle quickly, quietly, and on terms that make the criminal exposure go away. He looked at William. If he settles, he cannot be prosecuted for the fraud. The property transfers, including Henderson's, cannot be unwound. Clara felt the room shift. If he settles, the Hendersons don't get their land back, she said. Potentially. No, unless we build a settlement condition that requires it. Can we do that? Reese thought for a moment. We can attempt to. It strengthens our position to demand it. Whether Holloway accepts that condition is another question. He paused. If he fights, we have a stronger chance of a full unwinding on the Henderson land. But a court fight means months, possibly more than a year. And in that time, the provisional hearing on the South Meadow still happens on the 14th. And he could get temporary access. He won't, Clara said. Reese looked at her. With Pruitt's statement, the survey discrepancy, the Garrity affidavit, the false credentials documentation, and the east boundary deed, he will not get provisional access to the South Meadow on the 14th, she said. Crane is a good attorney, and this judge is not in Holloway's pocket. I've read every property ruling this judge has issued in the past 3 years, and he is consistent and careful and not sympathetic to manufactured claims. She paused. We push for the full hearing. We push for the Henderson condition. And we let Holloway decide if the cost of fighting is worth it. Reese looked at her for a long moment. You've read this judge's rulings, he said. I needed to understand the ground, she said. He looked at William. William was looking at Clara with the expression she had come to know best, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but held everything. Smile. She's right, William said. Reese was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, we push. He started writing. I'll need you both in Millerton on the 13th to review the final filing before it's submitted. And I need you, Carter, to be prepared to speak to your full ownership position if the judge asks. No more small cabin modesty, understood, William said. And Ms. Whitfield. Reese looked at her over his spectacles. I'm going to need you to walk me through the ledger reconstruction and the buyer correspondence. Because Holloway's attorney is going to argue that a woman with no formal legal standing has been managing property business beyond her authorization. And I want every document she touched to have an airtight paper trail back to your explicit instruction. It does, William said. I made sure of that. Clara looked at him. From the second week, he said quietly. After you sent the first round of letters, I backdated the authorization language to cover everything from the first day. He paused. I should have told you. Why didn't you? Because I didn't want you to think I was protecting you out of doubt, he said. I was protecting you because you'd earned it. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. On Thursday evening, Holloway came back, not with his attorney, not with the sheriff, who had resigned and was no longer his to use. Just Holloway and 2 riders. In the late afternoon when the light was long and the mountain was at its most quiet. William was on the porch when they rode up. Clara was inside. But she heard the horses and came to the door. Holloway didn't dismount. He looked at William from the saddle. The fixed smile was gone. The calculated pleasantness was gone. What was left was a man who had learned something from someone, probably Voss, about what was waiting for him in the counterfiling, and had ridden up a mountain to look the situation in the face before deciding what to do with it. "I know what you filed," Holloway said. "Then you know where things stand," William said. "I know you're planning to take this further than a property dispute. You took it further than a property dispute when you forged a county seal on assessment notices," William said. "We're just following where you led." Holloway's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "I want you to withdraw the adverse possession claim," William said. "I want a recorded easement agreement on the upper road at fair market rate. Retroactive 4 years. I want the Henderson property returned at the price the family received. Adjusted for improvements, with no legal action taken against the Hendersons for any aspect of the original transaction." He paused. "And I want you to have no further contact with any property holder in this valley for the purpose of acquisition. If you sell your own land, that's your business. You do not buy from anyone in this district for 5 years." Holloway stared at him. "You're asking me to effectively withdraw from this valley," he said. "I'm asking you to stop doing to people what you did to an old man who died with his land under threat," William said. "And to a 17-year-old boy who had to watch his father sign papers he was coerced into signing." He paused. "Those are the terms. Your attorney can review the formal settlement document with Reese. But those are the terms, and they don't move." Silence. One of Holloway's riders shifted in his saddle. Holloway looked at William for a long moment. Then his gaze moved to Clara in the doorway. "She did this," he said. "We did this," William said. "You were isolated up here," Holloway said. Not quite to William, almost to himself. "You had documentation gaps and a dead man's arrangement and a herd nobody knew the full value of. You should have been easy." "Nobody," Clara said from the doorway, "is as easy as you expect them to be when they finally have something worth standing for." Holloway looked at her. She looked back at him steadily. No anger in it, no satisfaction either. Just clarity. He looked away first. He turned his horse. He said nothing more. He and his 2 riders went back down the trail. And this time the sound of hoofbeats fading felt different from the other times, not a temporary retreat. Not a regrouping. Something more final. Cody appeared from the side of the cabin, where he had apparently been standing the entire time. "He's going to take the terms," Cody said, with the accents of a 20-year-old who had no real basis for his certainty. William looked at him. "What makes you say that?" William asked. "Because he looked like my uncle did, right before he folded his hand at cards," Cody said. "When he knew he was beat but didn't want to say it out loud yet." William turned to Clara. She was watching the trail where Holloway had gone. She was thinking about what Reese had said, they rely on their targets not knowing their own strength, and what William had said in the cabin. "On that first real evening, I wanted to know whether the man I was without it was worth staying for, and what she had said back to him. Without quite knowing how much she meant it, I have been in the middle of difficult situations for most of my life. This time I'm in the middle of it on my own terms." She turned from the trail. William was watching her with that expression, the one she had never quite been able to name. She understood it better now. It was the expression of a man who had spent a very long time not trusting what he saw in people, learning to hold himself back from it, and was now finding, with some surprise, that he didn't want to hold back anymore. "Cody," William said, without taking his eyes off Clara. "Go check the north fence line." A pause. "It's almost dark, sir," Cody said. "Going?" "Sir?" The sound of boots retreating fast. Clara looked at William. "He's going to take the terms," she said quietly. "Yes," William said. "And when he does, this is done," William said. "The fight, the filings, the pressure. Done." She nodded. "And then what?" she asked. He came down the porch steps. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples and the thing in his face that had been building since the night they'd talked by the cook stove fire until it burned low. Then, he said, "I'd like to show you something." She looked at him. "What?" "The valley," he said. "Behind the ridge. The ranch. The full thing." He paused. "I should have shown you weeks ago." I needed more time to be sure." "Sure of what?" He looked at her for a long moment. This man who said things when he meant them or didn't say them at all. "That showing you wouldn't change anything," he said. "Between us. That you'd look at it the same way you looked at the cabin." She understood what he was asking. "William," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what you said. I know what you've done. I know." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to say it again." The mountain was settling into the long blue of a Colorado evening. Somewhere in the upper pasture, cattle were moving to water. Somewhere down the trail, Richard Holloway was riding toward a decision that would end this. Clara looked at this man, this difficult, careful, surprising man who hid valleys and poetry books and laughed with his whole face, and had spent 3 years waiting for someone who would stay when there was nothing obvious to stay for. "It won't change anything," she said. "I already know what you are. The valley is just land." Something in his face finally fully let go. "Come on then," he said. "I'll show you in the morning." He went back up the porch steps and held the door open. She walked through it, and neither of them knew that in the morning, before they could ride to the valley, a letter would arrive from Millerton that would change everything they thought they knew about Dawson's death and set the final piece of Richard Holloway's reckoning into motion. The letter arrived before sunrise. Cody brought it up from Ridgeline on his early run, riding faster than usual, and he handed it to Clara on the porch with the look of someone who understood the envelope's important, even if he couldn't say why. The return address was Millerton, but the handwriting wasn't Crane's. It wasn't Reese's either. Clara turned it over. The seal on the back was from the Territorial Commissioner's office in Denver. She called William. He came out pulling his suspenders up, hair not yet combed, and she handed it to him without a word. He looked at the seal. He looked at her. He broke it open and read it standing there on the porch in the early gray light with the mountain still dark around them. She watched his face go through 3 different things in the space of 30 seconds. "What is it?" she asked. He handed it to her. She read. The Territorial Commissioner's office had received a referral from Bartholomew Crane regarding the pattern of fraudulent assessment notices in the Mountain District. Acting on that referral, the commissioner had assigned an investigator. That investigator, a man named Augustus Cole, no relation to Holloway's witness, had spent the past 2 weeks quietly reviewing county records across 3 districts. What he had found was not limited to Holloway's activities in this valley. Horace Gideon had operated as a false county agent in 7 districts over 4 years. 41 property transactions had been flagged as potentially coerced. The total land value transferred under fraudulent compliance pressure was estimated at over $200,000. And Gideon had been arrested in Laramie 4 days ago. Clara read that line twice. "They already moved," she said. "Before the hearing," William said. "Before we even knew they were looking. Crane sent them everything we had," Clara said. "He didn't wait for the 14th. He sent it the moment Pruett signed his statement." William took the letter back. He read it again more slowly. "There's more," he said. She knew. She'd seen it at the bottom of the letter, in the careful language of an official communication that was trying to convey something significant without overstating its certainty. The investigator had found, in Gideon's personal records, documentation of payments received for what was listed as preliminary assessment services in the Mountain District. The payments were dated. The most recent entry was 6 weeks before Dawson's death. The entry after Dawson's death listed a payment received, and the notation beside it, in Gideon's own handwriting, read property cleared. The porch was completely silent. "Property cleared," Clara said. "Yes," William said. "That isn't assessment language." "No," William said. "It isn't." She sat down on the porch step, not because she was unsteady, because she needed a moment with the full weight of what she was holding. Dawson had been 71 years old. His heart had given out. That was the official account, and it was probably true. A man of 71 with a hard life didn't need help dying. But pressure could kill a man whose heart was already fragile. And if Gideon had been on that property in the weeks before Dawson died, doing what he did on other properties, the intimidation visits, the manufactured notices, the grinding pressure of manufactured legal threat, he didn't cause Dawson's death directly, William said. He was following the same line she was. She could see it. But he created the conditions. Yes, and Holloway paid him for it. William set the letter down on the porch rail. He stood with both hands flat on the rail and looked out at the dark shape of the ridgeline against the slightly lighter sky. "I didn't protect him," he said quietly. "William, I knew Holloway was circling." Dawson knew. "And we thought we had time." His jaw was tight. "We thought we had time." Clara stood up. She came to stand beside him at the rail. "You were here when he died," she said. "You were with him, yes." "Then he wasn't alone," she said. "Whatever happened before, he wasn't alone at the end. That's what you gave him." He didn't say anything. But she saw the line of his shoulders change slightly, not releasing, but acknowledging. "Taking in, what happens to Holloway now?" she asked. "If Gideon's records show payment for services that contributed to Dawson's death," even indirectly, William picked up the letter again. "The commissioner's office has enough to pursue criminal charges independent of the civil case." "The settlement terms," Clara said. "If there are criminal charges, he can't negotiate them away," William said. "A settlement between us and Holloway covers the property dispute. It doesn't cover what he did to Dawson." Something moved through Clara. Not satisfaction, that wasn't quite the right word. Something more like rightness. The particular feeling of a thing landing where it was always supposed to land. "We need to tell Reese," she said. "Yes, and Crane, yes." He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He turned to look at her. After breakfast, she looked at him. After breakfast, he said again, more quietly, "There are things that need doing today that have nothing to do with Holloway. And I'd like to start with those." She understood what he meant. "The valley," she said. "The valley," he said. They ate quickly. Cody was sent to the north fence, a real task this time. A section of line that had been needing attention for a week. Pete had the herd. The cabin was quiet. They rode out together in the early morning. William leading on his bay and Clara on Ellen, up the back trail behind the cabin that Clara had never taken because William had never offered it, and she had not pushed. She had learned, with William Carter, that the things he offered mattered more than the things she could have asked for. That the timing of his openings was its own kind of language. The trail climbed for 20 minutes, switchbacking through the pines, and then it came over a ridge and Clara pulled Ellen to a stop. She had known intellectually that there was a valley. She had heard it described in documents and legal language, and Reese's careful professional assessment. She had understood in the abstract that this property was considerably more than a one-room cabin and a north pasture. But understanding and seeing were not the same thing. The valley below was wide and green, carved by a river that caught the early light and threw it back silver. She could see the cattle, hundreds of them, far more than the herd she'd been managing the books for. She could see the ranch house, low and solid and built to last, surrounded by outbuildings and a bunkhouse and a structure she identified after a moment as a hay barn large enough to winter twice as many animals as she'd known about. She sat on Ellen and looked at it for a long time. "Say something," William said beside her. "It's your father's," she said. "It's mine," he said now. "That's not what I mean." She turned to look at him. "This was his, and you kept it the way he left it. And you moved into the small cabin, and you've been protecting it. Not just legally. You've been keeping it safe from people who would want it for the wrong reasons." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "like Holloway. Like a lot of people he paused. My father built it from nothing. He came to this territory with less than your $32, and he worked 30 years, and he built something that mattered. And when he left it to me, I didn't want to become the man that other men came to for what he'd built. He looked at the valley. I wanted to be worth the valley, not the other way around. Clara looked at him. She looked at this man who had spent years alone in a small cabin above a hidden valley, testing himself against the question of whether he was enough without it. You are, she said. You have been from the beginning. He turned to look at her. Something in his expression was raw in a way she hadn't seen before, not painful, but open, the way a window is open, the way something is open when it finally, after a long time, gets to be. I know that now, he said. Because of how I've watched you work, and what you've said, and what you haven't said. He paused. And because the morning you arrived with those 2 bags and your split-toe boots and you looked at my cook stove and said, I know. And sit down, I knew then. I was just too careful to admit it. You are the most careful man I have ever met, Clara said. Yes, he said. Are you all right with that? She thought about her father, who had not been careful at all, who had been careless with the people in his life, and called it practicality. She thought about what careful actually meant, in the hands of a person who used it properly. Not withholding, not cold. Careful like a man who handles the things he values with attention, because he knows that value isn't preserved by accident. Yes, she said, I am entirely all right with that. They rode down into the valley. William introduced her to the full operation, the way a man introduces someone to the thing he's most proud of, not boastfully, but quietly, letting the thing speak for itself. The ranch foreman was a man named Hector, 50 years old, compact and efficient, who looked at Clara with an assessing eye and apparently reached a rapid conclusion, because he shook her hand firmly and said, Mr. Carter's been needing someone to see this place properly. Glad you finally came down. William looked at him. I said what I said, Hector said comfortably, and went back to his work. Clara walked the ranch house with William. It was built for a family bigger than needed for one man, with a real kitchen and a sitting room, and a study lined with books and a porch that ran 3 sides. It was clean in the way of a place that was cared for, but not lived in fully. A place waiting. In the study on the desk was a framed photograph. Clara stopped in front of it, an older man, gray-haired, with William's jaw and William's eyes, and the posture of a man who had worked hard enough for long enough that hard work had become the shape of him. Your father, she said. Yes, William said. She looked at the photograph for a moment. She thought about what it meant to be left something, by someone who loved you, not a burden. Like her father's 2 bags, but a gift, the valley. The cattle, the water rights, the solid-built house. The thing a man builds when he believes his child is worth building it for. He would have liked you, William said. You don't know that. I know it. He looked at the photograph too. He liked people who worked, and people who were honest, and people who didn't want anything from him except what they'd earned. He paused. He would have liked you before the end of the first day. Clara turned from the photograph. She looked at William Carter standing in his father's study, in the house he'd been keeping ready, in the valley he'd been protecting, with everything he'd built, and everything he'd inherited, and everything he'd been waiting to share with someone who would see it right. She thought, I walked up a mountain trail with 2 bags and split-toe boots because my father didn't want me anymore. She thought, and I found this. William, she said. I know, he said. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say something about how you didn't expect any of this, he said. And how it's a lot. And how you want to be sure before you say something you mean. She looked at him. You've been listening, she said. Since the beginning, he said. It's what I do when I can't find the words myself. She crossed the study. She stopped in front of him. I want to stay, she said. Not because of the valley. Not because of the ranch or the cattle or the water rights or anything in those documents. She held his gaze. I want to stay because of the man in the small cabin. The one who carried my bags and made me sit down and eat. And laughed when he forgot to hold it back, and signed authorizations to protect my work before he told me he was doing it. She paused. That man. I want to stay for that man. William looked at her. For a long moment he was quiet, in that way of his that she now understood was not absence but the opposite full presence. Working toward the thing he needed to say exactly right. Then stay, he said, permanently, as my wife if you're willing. As my partner in every part of this if you'll have it. He paused. I'm not asking because of what you've done for the property. I'm asking because I have been alone for a long time, and I didn't know what I was missing until you showed me. And I don't want to go back to not knowing. The study was quiet around them. Outside the valley moved on cattle grazing, the river running. Hector's voice somewhere giving instructions in his efficient way. The mountain doing what mountains do, regardless of what happens in the lives of the small people living on them. Yes, Clara said. Just yes. But the way she said it held everything: the mile and a half on the mountain trail, and the empty bowl, and the first morning coffee, and the ledger, and the letters, and Millerton and Holloway, on the porch, and the porch steps in the late light, and every night she'd lain on her cot with her hand on her mother's Bible. Holding on. She didn't need to hold on anymore. William put his hand on her face the way he did everything carefully. With full attention, like something he intended to get right. The 14th came. They rode to Millerton together. Clara and William, with Reese on one side and Crane on the other, and Margaret Garrity in a buckboard behind them, because she had decided she was attending the hearing whether anyone invited her or not, and nobody had been inclined to argue. The hearing lasted 4 hours. The judge was the careful, consistent man Clara had read in 3 years of property rulings. And he went through the evidence with the methodical patience of someone who understood that what he was holding was larger than one case. The survey discrepancy, the Garrity affidavit, Thomas Henderson's statement, Pruett's signed testimony, the false credentials documentation, the 2 compliance notices with the identical forged seal. Holloway was there with Voss and 2 other attorneys. And they fought it because men like Holloway always fight. Right up until the moment they realize fighting is making things worse. Voss was good. He argued vigorously on the adverse possession claim. Attacked the reliability of the counter-witnesses. Challenged Clara's legal standing 3 separate times. Each time Reese answered cleanly. The 3rd time Voss challenged Clara's standing. The judge took off his glasses and said, "Counselor, the authorization is documented, witnessed, and dated. I've reviewed it. Move on." Voss moved on. At the end of 4 hours, the judge ruled. The adverse possession claim was dismissed. The boundary discrepancy constituted fraudulent misrepresentation. And he was referring the survey matter to the Territorial Attorney's Office. The provisional access petition was denied. The east boundary deed was confirmed as recorded and valid. And then, the judge looked at Holloway directly and said, in the measured, careful tone of a man who chose his words with full knowledge of their weight, "This court has significant concerns about the pattern of conduct documented in these proceedings. I am forwarding the full record, including the testimony regarding assessment notice fraud and the investigator's preliminary findings, to the Territorial Commissioner's Office for review. That review will proceed independently of today's ruling." Voss touched Holloway's arm. Holloway sat very still. The judge stood the room. It was done. Outside on the courthouse steps, Margaret Garrity found Clara and took her hand in both of hers. Which was not a gesture Margaret made casually. Clara had known her long enough to understand that. "Well done," Margaret said, simply directly. "We did it together," Clara said. "You started it," Margaret said. "The rest of us just showed up." She squeezed Clara's hand once, firmly, and released it and went to find James. Thomas Henderson was standing at the bottom of the steps. He was watching Holloway and his attorneys moving through the crowd toward their horses. And his face held the complex expression of a young man who had gotten something he needed but not everything he'd hoped for. The criminal referral was real. The property fraud exposure was real, but his family's land was still in Holloway's name, pending the commissioner's investigation. Clara went down the steps to him. "The commissioner's investigation," she said. "Reese believes the Henderson transfer will be reviewed as part of it." Thomas looked at her. "Believes," he said. "The payment notation in Gideon's records property cleared connects Holloway directly to the fraudulent pressure on your father's sale. If that connection holds under the commissioner's review, the transfer can be challenged on criminal fraud grounds." She paused. "It's not certain, but it's real, and Reese and Crane are both willing to pursue it on your behalf." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I don't have money for attorneys," he said. "William will cover the costs," Clara said. "He already agreed." Thomas stared at her. "He doesn't know me," he said. "He knows what happened to you," Clara said. "And he knows what it means to have land that someone built and left you. He's not going to let that stand if there's a way to fix it." Something happened in Thomas Henderson's face. The practiced flatness cracked fully this time, not just around the edges. And underneath it was a 23-year-old who had spent 2 years blaming himself for something a grown man had done to his family with forged documents and calculated pressure. "Tell him." Thomas stopped. He collected himself. "Tell him I'm grateful." "Tell him yourself," Clara said. "He's right there." She walked him over. She watched William shake Thomas Henderson's hand and say something quiet that she couldn't hear from where she'd stepped back to. And she watched something shift in Thomas's posture, the particular shift of a young man's shoulders when someone older and capable says, "I've got this," and means it. She turned away to give them the privacy of it. Reese appeared at her elbow. "The commissioner's investigator wants a meeting," he said. "Next week. He wants both your statements regarding the timeline of Gideon's visits relative to Dawson's death." "We'll be there," Clara said. "It won't be pleasant. They'll ask hard questions. We'll answer them," she said. Reese looked at her for a moment. In the weeks they'd worked together, he had developed the habit of looking at her, at the end of things, not checking on her. Exactly. But the way a professional looks at someone whose quality they've been assessing and has arrived at a conclusion. "When I received your letter," he said, "I assumed Carter had written it and signed your name by mistake. The language was too precise, the case too completely laid out. I didn't know whether to be flattered or offended," Clara said. "Be flattered," he said. "Precision is rare. The combination of precision and courage is rarer." He paused. "You should consider the law." She looked at him. "I'm a woman. I know. It would be difficult," he said it plainly. Not apologetically. "But difficult is not impossible. And you have a better mind for this than most of the men I've practiced alongside." He adjusted his satchel. "Something to consider." He walked toward his horse. Clara stood on the courthouse steps in Millerton on a June afternoon and considered it. Holloway settled 3 weeks later. Not because he wanted to. Because the territorial commissioner's investigation had moved faster than his attorneys had anticipated. And Gideon had made a deal that included full disclosure of every client who had paid for his false assessment services. And Holloway's name was at the top of that list more times than could be explained away. The settlement terms were the ones William had stated on the porch. The adverse possession claim withdrawn, the East Road easement at fair rate retroactive 4 years. The Henderson property returned at adjusted price. The 5-year acquisition moratorium in the district. Voss sent the signed documents by courier to Crane's office. Crane rode them up to the mountain property himself, which Clara thought said something about Bartholomew Crane as a man. They sat on the porch, William and Clara and Crane, and went through the documents 1 page at a time. And when they were done, Crane shook both their hands and said, "In 30 years of practice, this is the cleanest resolution of a fraudulent acquisition case I have participated in." It is also the fastest. He looked at Clara. You have a rare talent for this. So I've been told, Clara said. Crane rode back down the mountain. Williams sat beside Clara on the porch steps with the signed documents in his hand and didn't say anything for a long moment. She let him have the silence. She had learned to read his silences the way she read ledgers. Each one had a different shape. And this one was the shape of a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. It's done, he said. Yes, she said. Dawson's land is protected. Yes, he looked at the documents. And Thomas gets his father's land back. The transfer is processing through the commissioner's office. It should be recorded within the month. He nodded slowly. He looked at the documents for another moment, and then he set them on the step beside him and looked out at the north pasture, where Pete and Cody were moving the herd in the afternoon heat. Unhurried and steady, the cattle doing what cattle do when the summer is long and the grass is good and nobody is threatening the water. I owe you something, William said. You don't, Clara said. Not as payment, he said, as truth. He turned to look at her. I spent 3 years waiting for someone who would stay when there was nothing obvious to stay for. And then you walked up that trail with 2 bags and you stayed. And I knew within a week. Maybe paused. And I want you to know that the thing I was most afraid of, that showing you the valley, would change how you looked at me, it didn't. You looked at my father's photograph, and you said he would have liked you as if it was a gift you were giving me. And it was. Clara looked at him. I grew up in a house where nothing I did was enough, she said. And I spent 27 years believing that said something true about me. She paused. You know what I've learned here? What? That the problem was never what I was, she said. The problem was where I was standing. Some ground doesn't let things grow, no matter how good the seed is. She looked at the north pasture, at the cattle in the afternoon light, at the solid log walls of the cabin behind them, and the trail that led up and over to the valley beyond. This ground is different. William took her hand. He held it the way he did everything with full attention. Like something he intended to keep. Clara Whitfield, he said. William Carter, she said. He almost smiled. We're going to get the preacher up here next week. Yes, she said. We are. He squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. The summer moved around them, the cattle and the pines, and the silver river in the valley below, and the mountain doing what mountains do. Holding everything up without being asked, steady and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small dramas of the people living on them. Except that the people living on them were not small. Clara thought about her mother's Bible on the shelf inside. No longer carried like a lifeline, but resting there the way good things rest when they've found their place. She thought about a letter she was going to write to her father, not to beg anything or explain anything or ask for anything, but simply to tell him the truth, that his daughter had found her way to somewhere solid, that she was needed and seen and valued, and that she wished him no harm. Because carrying harm for people who hadn't earned your care was a weight she was done carrying. She thought about Samuel Reese's words, on the courthouse steps you should consider the law, and she thought that she might actually consider it. She thought about Cody somewhere on the north fence line, saying she ain't just the bookkeeper. Sir, anyone can see that, in the way of someone young enough to say the obvious thing without self-consciousness. She thought about Margaret Garrity's hand in both of hers. She thought about Thomas Henderson's shoulders shifting when William said, "I've got this." She thought about the 40 feet on a survey map that had started everything. The east boundary deed Dawson had filed without telling anyone. The journal entries in an old man's blunt handwriting. The way one person's quiet, deliberate act of protection could reach forward through time and protect the people who came after him. She thought, that is what it means to build something that matters. She looked at William beside her on the porch steps. This careful, honest, complicated man who had carried her bags when she couldn't ask for help. Who had said things only when he meant them and had meant them every time. who had spent 3 years in a small cabin above a hidden valley, waiting to find out if he was worth staying for. He was. He had been from the beginning, and Clara Whitfield, the woman her father had handed off like a broken plow. The burden he'd sent up a mountain trail with 2 bags full of things nobody wanted. The woman who had been invisible for 27 years in rooms full of people who should have seen her was finally, completely, unmistakably home.